Hey, what's up everybody? It's Vernon from Firearms Tactical. With the new format of the channel, I've been doing a lot of thinking about how I wanted to approach things. And when I started kind of taking a look around at different firearms related channels on YouTube, one thing that I did notice was it didn't really seem like there were a whole lot of channels that kind of were catering to someone who might be completely unfamiliar with firearms. If you don't have a background, in firearms, or if you didn't grow up around them, like some of us maybe did, I really thought that it was going to be a great idea to kind of start from square one. Maybe you've been interested in firearms for quite some time. Maybe you do have some experience, but never really got any formal training with relation to firearms, or maybe you were interested in getting a permit to carry or a concealed carry permit in your respective state. But really, when you look around, there's not a whole lot of videos that start from square one that really teach how to stay safe, assuming that you've never touched a gun before. So that's kind of the way that I wanted to start with this, is kind of go over some of the basic firearms rules. Really, there's four of them that you need to remember. And if you follow those four, you're going to be just fine. We can talk about some additional things that I would say, not hard and fast rules, but really, really good ideas and things to keep in mind to keep yourself and the people around you safe. But really, there's four rules, and we're going to talk about those. And I want to talk about those in context as well, because that's, I think, in traditional, firearm safety classes, everything is really, they speak in a lot of absolutes. So always do this, never do that. But really, in the context of most of the other things that we're going to be talking about later on in the channel, it's going to be geared towards people who do have a permit to carry or a concealed carry permit, and they are going to be that's going to be their basis for what they want to learn about in relation to firearms training. So I'm going to approach these rules in that way because there really aren't. There's a lot of context, I think, that's and there's differences between simply going to the range where it's a really controlled situation and it's always this. You're always going to be taking your firearm in a case, unloaded. You walk up to this bench, you put everything down in front of you, and you fire in a specific direction every single time, and you kind of know what to expect. But when you start to enter the realm of being a citizen defender and walking around in public with a loaded firearm on you, those absolutes tend to be a little different. And really, the context of the situation that you may be required to operate in is going to be different. So I want to try to address these safety rules in a way that makes sense and are contextually responsible. So it's going to be a little bit different than the way you may have heard them before, but essentially the four, I can't do four, I keep wanting to go four, but the four main rules that we're going to want to keep in mind are, number one, let me start with the most important. So I've got a training pistol here. This is a plastic replica of a Glock 19. So it has no moving parts. Essentially, it's a toy. It's a piece of plastic, no moving parts. So, but for the purposes of this discussion, we're going to pretend like the camera is my safe direction, because there's nothing behind it, and because this is an inert firearm. There's nothing about this, short of you taking it and conking someone on the head. There's really nothing about this that could hurt anyone. So I would say rule number one, and the most important rule, and this is really, I think, the one where I can apply an absolute. I can say this, that rule number one, always keep your fingers straight and not only out of the trigger guard, or not only off the trigger, but off the trigger guard. So we call this high register position. So you're always, This is the absolute. You're always going to keep your finger off the trigger, and hopefully, and I recommend the high register position until you're on target and have made the decision to shoot. So there's a difference between being on target. So if you're on target but you have your finger on the trigger and you haven't made the decision to shoot yet and you get startled, what's going to happen? Bang. So that's why we throw that in there. So rule number 1, and this is the only one I think that's going to be an absolute, always keep your finger off the trigger and out of the trigger guard until you're on target and have made the decision to shoot. Okay, I want to shoot. Now I'm going to place my finger on the trigger. I'm going to fire. Rule number 1. I think if we always follow this rule, there's really very little chance of having an accident. So I would say this is the most important rule of them all. Always keep your finger straight and off the trigger until you are on target and have made the decision to shoot. I can't say that enough. So rule number 2, treat the gun as though it's loaded, even if you know for sure that it's not. This is an inert training firearm. I'm still going to treat it as though it's loaded. My safe direction is going to be this way. So I'm always going to be keeping it pointed that way and assuming that it's loaded. That goes for when you are alone in your house, when you're looking at someone else's firearm, when you're at the store receiving a firearm from a salesperson or from someone else. You're going to treat it as though it's loaded. Now, there are times when it will be loaded. So that's especially important. If you always treat it as though it's loaded, a lot of the things that you're going to do when it's loaded versus when you know it's not are going to be the same. Because if you're always treating it as though it's loaded, there's never going to be a problem when you're handling. So all these rules sort of integrate with one another. So rule number 1, always keep finger off the trigger. This is the one absolute, always. Always keep your finger off the trigger until you're on target and have made the decision to shoot. Number 2, always treat the gun as though it's loaded. So I think that those are the 2 absolutes. Now we're going to move on to some of the more contextual rules. Keep the gun pointed in a safe direction. A lot of people say always keep the gun pointed in a safe direction. Safe direction is a relative term a lot of the time. If you're in an indoor range and I'm facing the target that I'm getting ready to shoot at, this would be a safe direction. If I'm outdoors, for instance, on grass, slightly downward in front of myself could also be a safe direction. A lot of times, with rifles and things, people want to sling them over their shoulder. In certain instances with the action open, that can also be a safe direction. What I'm really trying to get at here is that sometimes it's really hard to reconcile safe direction with either concealed or open carry. For instance, I carry in the appendix position, and if you don't know, the appendix position is here. And if you can't tell, I'm having my firearm, even though it's plastic, is pointing at something that's very important. A lot of people would not consider that a safe direction. That's a problem. If you're following the traditional rules of firearms and you're using absolutes. So always keep the gun pointed in a safe direction. Well, it is in a safe direction in this context. It's in a holster that has trigger protection, and I'm not touching the trigger while it's pointing at my vital organs down there. So it's a better way to say it would be to keep your gun pointed in the safest possible direction. So in the case of walking around with a loaded firearm, you're going to keep it pointed in the safest possible direction and in its holster. And we're going to follow the other two rules. We're going to treat it as though it's loaded, and we're going to keep our fingers straight and off the trigger until we're ready to shoot. See how all these rules begin to work together? So even though we technically have the firearm pointed in a not so safe direction right now, there are other rules that are in play that are still keeping us safe. These are exceptions that we have to make when we decide to carry a firearm, whether concealed or open carry. The fourth very important rule works with the other three that we've talked about already. So you're not going to point your firearm at anything that you don't intend to destroy. Pretend like you've got a laser beam coming out the end of your firearm. Once again, I'm not going to say never or always, because once again, when we have this inserted into the holster, even if we're at 3 o'clock or 6 o'clock, but especially at appendix, it's going to be pointing at something that I don't want to destroy. So when I would say to modify this, when your firearm is out of the holster and the trigger is unprotected, which it is now, it is out of the holster and the trigger is not protected, don't point it at anything that you don't want to destroy. So that, when you're drawing and when you're going to punch out to begin to fire, you should always be aware of where your muzzle is pointed and minimize the amount of time that your muzzle or the end of your gun spends pointing at anything that you don't want to destroy. Now, I do understand that there is going to be seconds, if you're riding in a vehicle, or if you're carrying on your hip, and you have your leg a certain way, when you go to draw and you come and punch out, you're going to be essentially flashing your own leg for a split second. Those are things that we can't really avoid when we're talking about carrying a loaded weapon. So there are instances where saying always and never don't make sense, because we do have to do those things when we're manipulating our firearm. But the most important rule of all is trigger finger control, trigger discipline. This is why I talked about this rule first. If we always follow this rule, there will not be any unexpected incidents, accidents, or negligent discharges. So we're going to not point or aim our firearm at things that we don't intend to destroy when it's out of the holster and our trigger is unprotected. Those are basically the 4 ones that will keep you safe. I say make a gun to take a gun. If you want to try to figure out how to remember the first and most important rule, if I've got my firearm sitting on the table, I'm going to make a gun, like when you were a kid, you make a gun to take a gun. You're basically making a nice straight trigger finger, pick it up, and bada bing, you've got high register position from the get-go. You don't have to worry about your finger brushing the trigger or anything like that. So you can make a gun to take a gun. Pretty nice, simple, easy to help you understand. Keeping your finger off the trigger until you're on target and have made the decision to shoot. Treat your firearm as though it's loaded, even if you know it's not. Keep it pointed in the safest possible direction, which could be different depending on where you are. All right? And do not point your firearm at anything you are not willing to destroy when it's out of the holster and the trigger is unprotected. Okay? Now, there's some more things that I think are a good idea to keep in mind. Be aware of your target and what's beyond it. What does that mean? That means that anything that comes out of the end of this firearm, you're going to be responsible for. So you're responsible for each round that leaves your firearm. So you need to be absolutely sure what it is that you're taking aim at And once you release those rounds from your firearm, where those rounds are going to go, because you're responsible for each and every one of them. If you're shooting at a piece of paper at the range, that's one thing. But you still need to be aware of what's behind that piece of paper, because those projectiles, those bullets that come out of your firearm don't get stopped by the piece of paper. They don't always get stopped by a tree. They don't always get stopped by, a little makeshift backstop that your buddy put together out of, cardboard boxes. So you need to be sure of your target and what's beyond it. Now, in a personal defense scenario, that's especially important, because if you miss, where is that round going to go? You're responsible for it. If you hit and you get over penetration, what's beyond your target? Is that something that you're willing to destroy? These are things we need to keep in mind. Okay? But that's going to be different depending on the context of your situation. It's really important as well to learn your firearm. Take it apart. See how it works. Read the instruction manual. Before you ever put any ammunition in your firearm, you should understand exactly how it works. It's a really great idea when you first get a new gun. Read the instruction manual, take it apart, give it a good cleaning, make sure that you understand all the parts and how they work together, and become familiar with it before you ever take it to the range, before you ever put a round of ammunition in it. And we're going to talk about those types of things in videos in the future, but it's a very good idea to become extremely intimately familiar with your firearm before you ever load any ammunition into it. That being said, you're going to want to use the proper ammunition as well. Typically, somewhere on the barrel, this one doesn't have it because it's plastic, but there's a stamp on the barrel of your pistol that's going to say 9mm Parabellum or 45 ACP or 22 LR, which stands for long rifle, something like that. It's going to be stamped somewhere on either the upper receiver or the barrel of your pistol. It's a very good idea to double check and make sure that you are purchasing the correct ammunition for the caliber that your firearm is chambered in. It's pretty easy to figure out because it's always stamped somewhere on the gun. Also, good idea, make sure that your barrel is clear of obstructions before loading and shooting. Did you drop it last time you were at the outdoor range? Maybe a little rock got lodged inside the barrel that you didn't notice was there. That's why it's really important to continuously inspect, clean, and perform function checks on your firearm. If there's something in the barrel and a bullet goes traveling down at beyond the speed of sound, what do you think is going to happen if that bullet hits something that it can't expel? You're going to have an explosion of the barrel. So, good idea to periodically make sure your barrel is clear of obstructions. Another one, do not rely on your gun's mechanical safety. If you have an external safety, don't rely on that to keep you safe. The safety is just an extra measure of protection, and it should never be relied upon or used as a replacement for any of the 4 universal firearm safety rules that we talked about already. Mechanical safeties can fail. This can't. If you always keep your trigger finger straight and off the trigger until you're on target and have made the decision to shoot, that can't fail. You can control that. You can't control a mechanical failure. So don't rely on a mechanical safety to keep you and your loved ones safe. You're going to want to be aware of your surroundings when you're handling guns. So if you trip and fall, or if you lose your balance, or if there's a deer or something running through your line of fire while you're on the range, things like that. Just be aware of your surroundings at all times, and that's especially important for those of us who are carrying. We're going to want to be aware of our surroundings at all times. Is there something you could trip over? If you're at the range and you're doing exercises where you need to move, are there things that you could trip and fall over? You're bringing up your firearm in order to fire, and you trip and your finger's on the trigger. You haven't made the decision to fire, but you're tripping and whoops, you accidentally shot your friend in the leg. It's a good idea to be aware of your surroundings at all times. A couple extra things to be aware of before you wrap this up. Always listen and follow the rules of the range. If you're at a private range, it's good to be aware of what the rules are. Follow those rules. If you go to a range that has a range safety officer, make sure that you're aware of all the rules for your specific range. A lot of the times indoor ranges have range safety officers on duty. Sometimes places have different rules other than what you may be used to, but generally if you follow all the rules that we talked about today, you're going to be just fine. Oh, here's an interesting one. People sometimes think it's a fun idea to go down to a lake and just take shots at the surface of the water. That might be just fine for you, but if you think about when you're skipping a rock, what happens to that rock in order to get it to skip? It's rotating really fast and then it hits the surface of the water and skips across. What happens to a bullet when it comes out the end of your firearm? It's also spinning really fast. And if it hits that water at a certain angle, it can skip just like a rock. And even though you intended to shoot at the surface of the water, maybe 20 feet in front of you, there's a chance that that bullet, if it hits at the right angle, might end up a mile or so away and hit something that you really don't want it to hit. So, not really a safety rule per se, but as general practice, do not shoot at the surface of water or hard surfaces like a concrete wall. You wouldn't want to have a solid piece of metal that could ricochet. Now I know people use steel targets all the time, but those targets are specially designed and have specific angles that they're intended to be used at in order to deflect spalling and shrapnel from bullet disintegration in the right direction. Not back at you and not off into the distance where somebody else can get hit. So that's about all we've got today. We're going to do one quick review though before we go. You're going to treat your firearm as though it's loaded, keeping it pointed in a safe direction when it's out of your holster and the trigger is exposed. You're going to keep your finger outside the trigger guard and off the trigger until you're on target and have made the decision to shoot. Do not point your gun at anything you don't intend to destroy. Once again, when it's out of a holster and the trigger is unprotected, don't point it at anything you don't intend to destroy. That means no screwing around, no horsing around, and aiming it at something you shouldn't. There's a laser coming out the end. When it's out of its holster, there's a laser that will destroy anything it touches. Pretend. And you'll find yourself obeying all of these rules. And be sure of your target and what's beyond it. That's key as well. Always need to be mindful, always need to be aware of our surroundings. The next video is going to be a little bit less heavy-handed, a little bit more fun. I do have one interesting fact before we go. Talking about using proper ammunition. We know that we have an ammunition shortage right now, or it's a, well, I don't know what else to call it, but an ammunition shortage. So a pistol chambered in 9mm Luger, 9mm Parabellum, 9x19 is capable of firing a cartridge that is 380 ACP caliber. So 380 automatic Colt pistol will fire through a 9mm, a firearm chambered in 9mm. So we're going to do a little bit of testing on that. From what I understand, due to the case pressure, it's really not much of a safety issue. It will fire. It's not going to, I don't think it's going to damage your firearm. But what you most likely will have to do, especially if you're on like a full size, something like a Glock 17, or a SIG P320, something full size. If you are doing that, you will probably need to manually cycle the action, because the 380 rounds are probably not going to create enough gas pressure to automatically cycle the action the way it normally would. So you may, if you're in a pinch and you still want to shoot, you can get one round, bang, and then you probably are going to have to cycle the action, rack the slide manually to load another cartridge into the cylinder, bang, and so forth. Rack, bang, rack, bang. Now we're going to try that on the range and see what ammunition does or doesn't cycle in different firearms, as far as, you know, shooting a 380 through a 9mm. And we're going to talk to some experts and see how safe that is and whether there's a safety concern there. So stay tuned for that. That'll probably be down the line a little bit when I start to get bored doing all this other stuff. But this is Vernon from Firearms Tactical saying Baba Booey to y'all. Stay safe and have a happy holiday.